Mabuhay! Ako po si Catriona Gray, Miss Universe 2018 and NCCA Arts Ambassador. My love for Philippine culture and the arts was not something that I was born with due to my mixed heritage. It was something that was grown, learned, and embodied. And I have fervent hope that we can continue to instill love and passion for Philippine arts and culture in each of us, especially among the second and third generation of Filipinos who are physically distant from their roots. For this, I would like to invite everyone to get to know more about our rich heritage through Sentro Rizal, our cultural centers dedicated for the global promotion of Philippine culture, arts, and languages. To date, we have 35 centers across the globe. Visit the NCCA website and Sentro Rizal Instagram to know more about their activities. Sentro Rizal, Sentro ng Filipino. Tuloy pa kayo!
True or false? The Philippines was discovered by Ferdinand Magellan in 1521. Answer: false. The Philippines was not discovered by Magellan. Groups of pre-Hispanic indigenous peoples had settled various parts of the country, and indigenous cultures had already been flourishing well before the 15th century. Indigenous women spent hours thinking up complex and meaningful textile patterns. The Mangyan were already creating ambahan or poetry, usually etched on bamboo. The Kankanae buried their dead in hanging coffins to bring them closer to the sky or God. This was the rich tapestry that, in a series of colonizations, Spain and America would dramatically change. Filipinos rallied against these powers, drawing upon a blossoming sense of nation. Like its iconic dessert halo-halo, Filipino identity is not just one thing, but a fascinating union of traditions, cultures, and influences. For Filipinos abroad hungry to know more about their roots and identity, Sentro Rizal is the best place to start. Often located in Philippine embassies, Sentro Rizal is the Philippines' cultural center abroad. There are over 30 sites of Sentro Rizal across the world. Sentro Rizal offers a treasure trove of Filipiniana and holds activities that celebrate Philippine culture. It has training courses for volunteer teachers and lessons and books on rules and writing and spelling in the Filipino language. Sentro Rizal also has books and multimedia materials about Filipino culture and arts. Learn more about the People Power Revolution, a model of nonviolent regime change that other nations have emulated, or how Filipinos used egg whites mixed with lime as mortar for large stone blocks to build massive churches. Sentro Rizal also organizes cultural and educational activities such as lectures, film showings, exhibits, performances, food festivals, and workshops. Sentro Rizal's doors are also open to foreigners who are interested to know more about the Philippines, including its trade and tourism opportunities. The center is named for Philippine hero Dr. Jose Rizal, whose books No Limitangere and El Filibusterismo helped spark the Philippine Revolution against Spain. Rizal lived abroad for many years, but distance only fanned the flame of his love for country. Filipinos, like Rizal, can remain Filipino at heart, even as they make their home in other parts of the world. By keeping alive the ties of Filipinos overseas to their culture, Sentro Rizal helps preserve the fabric of Philippine society. Visit Sentro Rizal today to learn more about the Philippines and embrace your Filipino roots.
Good Thursday evening from everyone in San Francisco, and good Friday morning for those joining us in Manila. I am Vanessa Bagoliona, Consul at the Philippine Consulate General in San Francisco. Welcome to our webinar, Rizal in San Francisco, Connections in Philippines-U.S. History, with Dr. Ambeth Ocampo as our resource speaker. This virtual event is brought to you by the Sentro Rizal in San Francisco, which is the cultural arm of the Philippine Consulate General here in San Francisco. We are able to do this with the valuable support of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. This event is one of the projects that we are doing this year in celebration of the 75th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between the Philippines and the United States. Some house rules for our webinar. We'd like to remind everyone joining us that your videos are disabled and only the speaker's videos can be seen online. We are also streaming live now on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/PHINSF. This webinar is being recorded, as you can see, and we can share it to others later on. While your microphones are muted, you may send your questions through the chat box, or you may post your questions on our Facebook page in the comment section, and we'll read it so our resource person can respond. Thank you, and at this point, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Honorable Neil Frank R. Ferrer is the Consul General of the Philippines in San Francisco, which has consular jurisdiction over Alaska, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Northern California, Northern Nevada, Oregon, Utah, Washington State, and Wyoming. Consul General Ferrer is a career diplomat with extensive experience in the Foreign Service, including consular work, bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. He has served in various capacities at the Philippine embassies in Beijing, London, and Ottawa. He served as Philippine Consul General in Vancouver, Canada from 2013 to 2018. Consul General Ferrer is a recipient of a distinguished award for Filipino diplomats, the Gawad Mabini, with the rank of Dakilang Kamanong Grand Cross, conferred by the President of the Republic of the Philippines on June 29, 2010. He began his tour of duty as Consul General here in San Francisco on January 20, 2021. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Consul General Ferrer for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Consul Vanessa. Dr. Ambeth R. Ocampo, our resource person for today's webinar, Rizal in San Francisco, Connections in Philippines-U.S. History, members of the Filipino-American community, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to everyone in San Francisco and across the United States, and good morning to those joining us in Manila. I hope that everyone is keeping safe and healthy at this time. On behalf of the Philippine Consulate General and Sentro Rizal San Francisco, I would like to warmly welcome all of you to our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to thank especially Dr. Ambeth Ocampo for his time and preparations for this important online event. We are fortunate to have you at this webinar. You have made learning about Philippine history interesting, not only to students of history, but the public at large. Thank you so much for all the scholarly works you have done, especially as regards our national hero, Dr. Jose Rizal. We are also grateful to the National Commission for Culture and the Arts for its valuable support to this event and to the Sentro Rizal San Francisco. As the title of our event suggests, we expect to know about connections in Philippine-U.S. history that we may not be aware of or that we may be aware of, but about which we can make better sense of. With more than 500,000 Filipinos in the San Francisco Bay Area, and more than 1 million Filipinos in other states across our consular jurisdiction, we deem it necessary for us to connect the dots, so to speak, and learn from our shared histories. It is also important to do this as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and the Philippines. For a start, the Philippine Consulate General in San Francisco was established immediately upon gaining Philippine independence from the United States in 1946. Our history is also largely tied to the Pacific War that saw Filipinos and Americans fighting side by side against a common adversary. We are also strategically located at the heart of downtown San Francisco, which is a stone's throw away from the Union Square where the Dewey Monument is located. We are also celebrating Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month this May, and it is noteworthy to make connections in our histories and cultures as we face the all-important issue of stemming the tide of anti-Asian sentiments, especially in the context of the current COVID-19 pandemic. This brings me to a historical fact that got us all thinking about making connections in the larger history of Philippines-U.S. relations. When I arrived in January, one of the pieces of information I learned was that 10 minutes away from the Consulate General is the historic Palace Hotel, where our national hero, Dr. Jose Rizal, stayed from May 4 to 6, 1888, during his only visit to the United States. Today, one can see a marker commemorating this event on the hotel's exterior wall. I hope that in your next visit to the Consulate General in San Francisco, you will remember the close relations between the Philippines and the United States and the moments in our history like that of our national hero's stay in San Francisco and his travel to other parts of the United States that are still relevant to this day and age. Once again, thank you for joining us today and let's enjoy this webinar. Maraming salamat po. Mabuhay.
Thank you, Consul General Neil Ferrer. Our main speaker for this event is Dr. Ambeth Ocampo. He is a public historian whose research covers 19th century Philippines, its art, culture, and the people who figure in the birth of the nation. He is a full professor and former chair of the Department of History of the Ateneo de Manila University, and he has held previous teaching appointments at the University of the Philippines in Diliman, De La Salle University, San Beda University, and Sophia University in Tokyo, Japan. He was a visiting research fellow at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand, and at Kyoto University in Japan. In his lucid moments, he writes an editorial page column on history for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, and he has published over 35 books, the most recent being Looking Back 15, Martial Law by Anvil in 2020, and Yaman, History and Heritage in Philippine Money for the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas in 2021. He moderates growing Facebook and Instagram pages. In another time, another life, he spent time in a Benedictine monastery. He also served as president of the City College of Manila and as co-chair with Filipino journalist, historian, and author Ms. Carmen Guerrero Nakpil at the Manila Historical and Heritage Commission, after which he moved on to be the president of the Philippine Historical Association and chairman of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, while he served as the concurrent chairman of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Ambeth Ocampo. Sir.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I will share my screen now. Okay, hope it is working. Thank you very much again to the Philippine Consulate in San Francisco. In 2019, on my last Sentro Rizal tour, I was in Europe, and I did a Canada East Coast lecture series, and I was hoping that I would be able to go to the West Coast and visit the consulate again. But the pandemic brought us into this mode of communication, and I'm glad that even if we are miles apart, half the world away, we can still be able to communicate through Zoom and Facebook. So before I start, I just want to give a few advertisements. One is that I hope you can follow me on Instagram or on Facebook. And if you have friends in the Philippines, that I hope you can also buy some of my books, the most popular being Rizal Without the Overcoat, which has been in print for the past 31 years. Now, today we're going to talk about Rizal because in 2021, we commemorate the 160th anniversary of Jose Rizal's birth, the 125th anniversary of his death. And one wonders whether Filipino who lived so long ago can still be relevant to us today. We are so used to Rizal. The picture that you have on the left is his most famous picture. It is the picture on which the Luneta Monument has been um, fashioned. And one wonders, when we think of Rizal, we always think, like history, it is old and it is irrelevant. But I have researched during the pandemic, and during the pandemic, I was able to even do play with this app that could actually make an old archival an old archival photograph move. So it's a bit eerie to see Rizal moving, closing his eyes, smiling. I haven't tried this on my Lola yet because it's too personal to try. But with Rizal, it was quite good, and it's a bit crazy because the next step from this was that you are actually able to put your face into Rizal's, or you can put someone else's face into Rizal's. So this is Senator Pacquiao in Rizal's face. So uh, the the we are able to look at history in new ways, but we are also challenged because now with this technology, you will be able to create deep fakes or fake news that means that in our times we have more need of critical thinking. Now, we should ask ourselves at the beginning of this webinar, why are most Filipino heroes male, old, and dead? Are heroes and heroism old? Is history irrelevant? Do we still have heroes today? I'd like to think that we still have heroes today, but they come in a different form and shape. So, would you want to remember Rizal today as this man in this archival photograph? Or do you want to still have the same Rizal, but you will have him with spiked hair, better glasses, and a better suit? So the point here is that we have to look back in our history so that we can deal with the present and look forward to the future. But by doing that, most of the time, I realize in my 30 years of teaching that many Filipinos have lost their appreciation for useless information. For example, it is not very well known that Manila and San Francisco are sister cities. And in 1986, I was here when they signed this agreement. It was then Mayor Feinstein, who's now in the Senate. And when I thought about this, most people have relatives in San Francisco, but they do not realize that the cities share as not only people but also a shared history. Conjen has mentioned that in Union Square there is the Dewey Monument, which today again is a bit controversial. There are some people who say America should not look back into their imperial past and maybe we should get rid of this. But I'd like to think that good or bad, history is there to remind us. So we should not cancel it, but we should learn to appreciate it more. The magic of history is not in learning, all the names, dates, events. What is important in history, the magic of history is actually finding connections between disjointed things. In Union Square, when I used to go to San Francisco, I mean, my family, they're great shoppers. We would usually start from Union Square and they'll say, in 3 hours, let's meet here in the monument, and everyone runs off. I mean, there used to be a big bookstore on Union Square, so that's the only place where I would go. And afterwards, I would just stroll around the square, and I didn't realize much until I was much older. When I had nothing better to do and people were late. So I read the text on the marker and I was very surprised that at the base of the Union Square Dewey Monument, you find out that it was the groundbreaking was by William McKinley. It was dedicated by Theodore Roosevelt, and you see that this actually talks about the Battle of Manila Bay. So when you go around the monument, you will not only remember George Dewey, but you will also know the names of the ships that fought in Manila Bay. Um, to give you an idea of what Divi's flagship look like. This is the Olympia. And then if you go around the monument, you will see first the Secretary of the Navy's telegram to George Dewey saying you should go to the Philippines and destroy the Spanish fleet. Then there is a short narrative of how on the night of April 30th, 1898, Dewey's squadron entered Manila Bay. And on May 1, they met the fleet of the Spanish Admiral Montojo. Montojo happens to be an ancestor of the present Sobel Ayala family. And this was his flagship, very proud flagship, the Reina Cristina. And this is what it looked like after the battle. Now, when I was in college, I was told that if you compare the two navies that were there, Spain had two protected cruisers, five unprotected cruisers. All of their fleet was sunk. And the US only had one ship that was damaged. But what was important, and this is the only thing I remember from this lesson in my college life, was that if you look at the fatalities, the Spanish lost 161 people. They had 210 wounded. The US only had one fatality, and my teacher used to say he died of heat stroke, not of the fighting, and there were nine wounded. But what is the importance or the relevance of the Dewey Monument? It should remind you that in 1898, the first shot in the Spanish-American War did not happen anywhere near Madrid or Washington. It happened half the world away in Manila Bay. And the end of that war is also connected to the history of San Francisco. If you go up to the Presidio, you will find that many veterans of the Philippine-American War are buried there. No, many of the soldiers who were sent to the Philippines were embarked from San Francisco. So in that way, we have that other common history. When I went up to the Presidio, I couldn't find Funston because I was looking for a big monument, and I only found out that he had a very simple monument. It just says that he was a major general in the US Army. He died in 1917. He was a hero of San Francisco. But why is he important? He's important because he was the guy who captured Emilio Aguinaldo in Palanan, Isabela in 1901. Um, and when I was looking for the Funston Monument, I wanted to kick it, but there were people who were taking me around. But you see that this connection, the beginning of the Spanish-American War, happens in Manila Bay, and with the capture of Emilio Aguinaldo, the fighting continued, but it showed uh, America taking on a new colony. Now, before we get into Rizal and San Francisco, I just want to tell you that in other parts of the United States, we have many things that await research and appreciation. This is a photograph I saw in an old book talking about Aguinaldo's family and his relatives. And I looked at this grainy picture and I couldn't see Aguinaldo in it. And obviously, it was taken abroad. But 2 years ago, when I went on my Sentro Rizal tour, I saw a clearer copy in the U.S. Library of Congress in Washington. And when I looked very, very closely at these people, you will see that this was taken in Paris. Um, and here you will actually see Juan Luna is seated on the right. And in the middle, you actually see Jose Rizal. No, this is a picture that people did not know about because they thought it was a picture of Aguinaldo's family. So I'm sure, I mean, I was just going through the library. I only had 2 days and I found this, which means that if you give me 6 months, I will probably find much more. After Washington, I proceeded to Chicago in 2019 to visit the Newberry Library, which not many people know has a very big Filipiniana collection that includes a number of Rizal's actual handwritten diaries and some letters of Jose Rizal. Now, there are people who are asking why this is in Chicago and not in the National Library in Manila. These things were not stolen during the war nor during the American colonial period. These were bought by an American collector, and were donated to the Newberry Library. And I'd like to think that if these things were in Manila, they might have been destroyed during the war, and now they are very well preserved in Chicago, accessible to anyone who has suitable ID, and I think some of it can even be accessed online. So there is a lot in the United States in our history that can be found if we are willing to look for them and to find connections with them. Now, Rizal's only trip to America was very brief. It was only from April 28 to May 16, 1888. And the other night when I was doing my slides, I decided to open a Google map and just to plot out the points that Rizal actually mentions in his diary. And when I looked at the map, I mean, I was amazed because today, if I travel from San Francisco to New York, I would take a plane. But Rizal went by land, and he went through the entire, well, from end to end of the United States to catch a ship. Now, as Conjen mentioned, I also visited the Palace Hotel once, and when I went in, I was so amazed how luxurious it was, and wondering why Rizal even stayed in this hotel. But I will tell you later why Rizal usually stays in nice hotels and why he always traveled first class when he was traveling. There is a marker outside, a very long marker, which most people do not read, and we should look at it again and ask ourselves what was the relevance of Rizal's stay then and what was its relevance to us today. Now, Rizal was in San Francisco from April 28 to May 6. But if he actually was on land only for 2 days, May 4 and 5, before he started on his trip to New York, we actually have his letter to his family where he actually complains because he was kept in quarantine in the boat for almost a week. And this becomes very relevant to us today in the in the age of the pandemic and COVID, where we think about quarantine. No? And I mean, if you are coming from the US and you come to the Philippines, you will be quarantined for 2 weeks. No? So the point here is that suddenly something that was old and irrelevant to us suddenly becomes relevant because of Rizal's experience. So Rizal writes to his family and he says, they are crazy about quarantine. They have strict customs inspection. They impose tax after tax, and it was enormous. Not content with that, he also wrote to his friend Ferdinand Blumentritt and also complained about the U.S. Customs and Immigration Service. So I'd like to think that this first experience of being quarantined, he could see San Francisco, but they were not allowed to disembark. This colored his entire trip. And so since he was so unhappy, he did not write very much. In other diaries, he describes everything, but the short trip to the United States, I think, was ruined by his experience of quarantine. What made the experience of quarantine worse was that Rizal wrote that there was going to be elections in 1888, and the officials wanted to show that we have to protect ourselves against the Chinese. As you know, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act. They didn't want Chinese to come into the U.S. to work and live. So again, this thing has resonance to us today in the days where there is a very strong anti-Asian bias, and some of our countrymen have actually suffered not just verbal but actually physical abuse. Now, in another letter to another friend, he actually exaggerates and says that we were in quarantine for 13 days. Actually, he was only quarantined for 6 days. But I was amused when I saw that he says afterwards only the passengers in first class, that includes him, were allowed to land. But those of the second and third class, meaning Japanese and Chinese, remained on board the ship for an indefinite period. So when you go to the Palace Hotel, this is what it looked like in 1887. The Palace Hotel that you see today is already renovated. There used to be this big interior court. Carriages would come in, but today this is a lobby. And, you know, when you bring your luggage in, even today they'll give you a paper luggage tag. In the past, it was a metal or a brass luggage tag. So Rizal traveled first class not because they could afford it, but I'd like to think that Rizal always traveled first class because it was one way that he would not be prejudiced, or at least he would be treated much better than if he stayed in economy. And remember, if you watched Titanic, the movie, only the people in first class have salvavida and lifeboats. The people in third class will sink with the ship. So this was a way for Rizal to survive much discrimination, but again, he was very upset by his experience. Now, when I plotted it out, I found out that after 2 days at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, May 4 and 5, on May 6, he traveled to Oakland. uh, he took a ferry to Oakland, and then from there he took a train, and then the train took him to Costa to Benicia. The whole train was placed on a ferry, no, and then they moved on, and then he had dinner in Sacramento. He slept on the train, and he had breakfast in Nevada on May 7th. Now, the interesting thing here is when you read his diary, it's just about him waking up in a new place. So he had dinner in Sacramento and he woke up in Reno. Uh, After this, he traveled on. They were in Ogden, Utah by May 8th. He changed trains. He mentioned seeing young Mormon men in Farmington, Utah. They proceeded to Salt Lake City and Provo. And he noted in his diaries that there were more women than men in Utah. And how did he get this conclusion? He says, when I eat in the restaurant, we are served by waitresses rather than waiters. So he has many of these little comments while he's traveling. And I wonder what the train sleepers were like in his day. But when he woke up on May 9, he was in Colorado, and he noted with annoyance that the porter of the Pullman car, an American, meaning a white person, was somewhat of a thief. So I think either he asked for a tip or he cheated him in some way. We do not know what that was. Then he mentions that in Colorado, they adjusted their timepieces by an hour. He also noticed that there were more trees in this area of the United States than the 3 states that he had passed. Then on May 10, he woke up in Nebraska, and by 4 p.m., he was in Omaha. He mentioned the Missouri River that he estimated was, quote, about twice the Pasig in its widest part. So when Rizal is abroad and describing things, his point of reference is always the Philippines and what he knows from the Philippines. So May 11, he woke up in Chicago, where because the departure was in the evening, so this was a transit point, he was able to walk around the city. And Rizal noted while walking around Chicago that every tobacco shop had a statue of an Indian outside. And each of these statues of Indians were always different. So from Chicago, they went to Ontario, not the US side, on May 12, and they stopped at Niagara Falls, which he saw from the Canadian side. And he stood at the foot of the majestic falls and was led to write in his diary, quote, though not as pretty nor as mysteriously beautiful as the falls in Los Baños, it is much more gigantic and imposing that no comparison is possible. They departed that night, and he woke up on May 13 in Albany, New York. They passed the Hudson River, which he described as a river whose banks are as beautiful, although a little lonely in comparison with the Pasig. And he finally arrived in New York City, stayed in a hotel there, and on May 16, took the second largest ocean liner at the time to take his trip from New York to Liverpool. Now, when you think about it, Rizal was a great traveler. About one third of his life, about 9, almost 10 years of his life, were spent traveling. So in his old age, he actually said that travel is a caprice in childhood, a passion in youth, a necessity in manhood, and an elegy in old age. When you think about it, Rizal's first trip to Europe was to study. He stayed from 1882 to 1887. The second trip was he came home, but because the Noli Me Tangere was controversial, he was forced to go back abroad. And it was on this second trip that Rizal visited the United States. On his first trip in 1882, in his diary, Rizal actually drew from the ship the silhouette of Manila, and he describes how it gets smaller and smaller as he gets farther and farther, and then it disappears. But what was important about travel was that Rizal was not traveling for leisure. He was traveling to learn things, to study. And he says that, all modern societies advance because of travel. And so people have gone abroad to search for knowledge. And in terms of Rizal, I'd like to think that Rizal studied a lot to bring most of these things back home. So it is unfortunate that Rizal wrote a lot for a nation that does not read him. He left 25 volumes of writing that nobody reads, no, only me. And if you take the time to look at his notebooks, you will find that he has notes on ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. He actually has notes on in Hebrew, and I was amazed he even started learning to conjugate in Arabic, and of all the words that he started to conjugate, it was the verb matar, meaning to kill. And I thought, why was this? And friends who took Arabic tell me, no, that has no significance. The easiest word to conjugate in Arabic is the word to kill, no, matar. When he went to Japan, he started to try writing also in Japanese. So these words you see here is the word for Nihon, and then he wrote in Spanish Hapon. No, so again he tried to draw. He was a good drawer, but he drew a Japanese woman in the Japanese style, and the characters on the right again tell us Nihon. So Rizal tells us that in his time and even in our times, man is multiplied by the number of languages he possesses. And when he studied in Manila, of course, he knew some Spanish, he had Tagalog from his childhood, and in school he learned Latin and Greek. So when we think that people Rizal had such many languages, it was because of his foundation of in Latin, which made most European languages easy for him to study. Now, this is one long letter that Rizal wrote to Ferdinand Blumentritt when he was in exile in the Pitan. He knew that the Spanish were opening his mail. So he would write in many languages. So you see on the left, he starts in German, and you can see he can write in this 19th century German Schrift. Even Germans today cannot write in this handwriting, and it's very difficult to read. On page 2, he shifts from German to English. Uh, on page 3, he shifts from English into French. On page 4, he shifts from French into Spanish, and then on the last page, he shifts to Italian. And he says, please write to me in many languages because I don't want to forget the many languages I learned in Europe. But you must remember that although Rizal was multilingual, he never forgot Tagalog. As a matter of fact, when he traveled to Europe, he carried with him in his luggage a copy of Balagtas, Florante at Laura so that he could read it aloud and make his learning of Tagalog even better. Um, Rizal is actually the person who is responsible for the way in which we write Tagalog today. You get rid of the letter C, use K, things like that were things that Rizal thought about already in the 19th century. But this last page from his translation of William Tell from the original German to Tagalog, on the last page, he actually even writes out the pre-Hispanic baybayin. No? So what you have to see here is while Rizal traveled, unlike most Filipinos who travel, when you travel for the first time for an extended period, you become homesick. You become homesick for family, you miss Philippine food, you miss our weather. And I'd like to think that when Rizal traveled, those 9 years that he was traveling, Rizal learned to love his country more when he was abroad. And that made him the hero that he was. But going back to America, Rizal, unfortunately, was not impressed with America. And again, as I told you, we can blame this for his quarantine in San Francisco. And Rizal actually says that he doesn't advise anyone to make a trip to America. And he explains that while visiting the largest cities of America, he realized that America is a great country, but it has many defects. And Rizal actually says, America is a land of promise. Poor people who want to work can better their lives if they come to America. But when he traveled, like when he got to New York, he stayed in this beautiful hotel in Fifth Avenue. And I was thinking, it would have been, he would have been delighted by New York. But again, Rizal writes in his diary, I was in New York. It was a big city, but there everything is new. And so when you read this, you realize that he was unimpressed because Rizal's maturity came about in Europe. He was practically Spanish, so in a way he was more European than American. So he missed um, the energy and the aggressiveness of a young America because he saw it from the eyes of a European, and in his very European cosmopolitan way of thinking, he saw the United States as something that was a bit of an upstart. But the most important thing, and I think what makes Rizal relevant in our day, is not so much the pandemic. Um, Rizal mentions in his diary that one of the defects of America was that there is no real civil liberty. And then he noted that in some states, a black man cannot marry a white woman or vice versa. And then again, in the light of today's anti Asian racial discrimination, he actually says that because of the hatred of the Chinese, other Asians, like the Japanese, are confused with them and are disliked by ignorant Americans. Um, Rizal actually had Chinese features, but maybe he would have been mistaken for something else, no, like a Latino. But in Europe, Rizal also experienced racial discrimination. He hated it when he would walk in Spain and that the children would call him Chino and they would make fun of him. Um, in one museum in Paris, I saw a letter. He was looking at Japanese art. And there were some Frenchmen who saw that he was foreign and said, you must be a Japanese. And Rizal didn't say he was Filipino. Rizal claimed that he was Japanese. And then he started to explain all the paintings in the room until one of the French people asked, how come you speak our language so well? Uh, why are you here in Japan? And then he says, I'm from a distinguished family. My parents wanted me to learn Western ways, so they sent me to Europe. And then somebody pointed to Japanese characters in the paintings and said, can you translate these Japanese characters for us? And then Rizal pretended to go to the bathroom and he disappeared. But it's funny that even if he experienced discrimination, sometimes he would pretend to be Chinese. No, they would call themselves in Madrid the Inchiks, or he would pretend to be Japanese. But what is important also is that in the 19th century, Filipinos were called by the derogatory term Indio. But in 1889, when they were in Paris, they went to the American Pavilion in the World's Fair and they watched the Buffalo Bill cowboy show. And when Rizal saw this, it was the usual thing, the cowboys, lasso, they're shooting, then there were Indians there. And Rizal said, the Indians are very, very brave and very proud. And so they decided, In Spanish, they call them the Indios Bravos. So they said, why should we be ashamed of what we are? Why don't we take Indio as a badge of courage and use it for ourselves? And that's why they call themselves the Indios Bravos. It's the same way in which the term Moro, which has a derogatory connotation, um, in the 70s and 80s, they took it as a badge of courage and they established, say, the Moro National Liberation Front. So what was once a derogatory term becomes a badge of pride. So when we think of Rizal's short trip to America, and it becomes relevant to us, it shows you how Rizal experienced racial discrimination but was not crushed by it. It made him better. It made him communicate with other cultures because he felt that one way to change racial discrimination is to have mutual understanding. And you do that by getting to know other cultures and also getting to make your culture and your people known, which is what the consulate does, what Centro Rizal does today. So when we think about it, uh, what is this thing about Rizal and quarantine and racial discrimination? It only points to the fact that history does not repeat itself. It's one of the things that is taught in school that we have to unlearn. History doesn't have a mind of its own. History doesn't have the power to rule us. So history doesn't repeat itself. It is actually people. It is we who repeat it. And we repeat it because we don't know it. So I'd like to think that again, 160 years since Rizal was born, I hope that you will go back and not just think about him as a national hero and forget about him, but actually to try and read the novels first. Because when you read the novels of Rizal, read them as literature, enjoy them, and you will see how in these novels Rizal tells us how to be Filipino, what it is to be Filipino. So it is going back to history. Going back to history is finding connections so that the future will not read like the past. So I leave you with a quote from Rizal on history. Please remember that they keep saying, ang hindi marunong lumingon sa pinanggalingan, di makakarating sa paroroonan. Uh, that is not by Rizal at all. The same thing as the most quoted line from Rizal sa aking kababata, ang hindi marunong magmahal sa sariling wika, masahol pa sa hayop at malansang isda. That's also not by Rizal. So I'd like to leave you with a quote from Rizal, which I think is relevant to us today. He said, in a play that he wrote, he said, I entered the future carrying a memory of the past. And this is the way that we must take history. We are not imprisoned by history. We take it with us to give us the the strength and the understanding to cope with the present and to look at the future with hope. Thank you and good morning. Well, there's no influence because he was not translated until around the late 19th century. It's only now that Rizal is available in English from Penguin Books that Rizal has garnered a bigger audience. Now, they used to say that Rizal was influenced by American literature, being Uncle Tom's Cabin, but it seems that also is not true. No? But there's somebody who mentioned, and I didn't realize this in the chat. Somebody said that the Olympia, George Dewey's flagship, was actually the same name as one of Rizal's sisters. Now that's interesting. Somebody also said that it's the pronunciation of Niagara. I mean, we read things in Spanish, no, like Arkansas in Filipinos will read as Arkansas, no. And so even that we read it as Niagara. No? So anyway, yes. Any other questions, please? There was a Japanese guy who was actually a writer who was on the boat and he only knew Japanese. And so Rizal was the one who did the interpreting from him because Rizal learned a little Japanese when he was in Japan. So they spent time together on the trip. And when this Japanese went back to Japan, he actually wrote a novel in which the main character is a Rizal character, no, a man from Manila. He was called. So when Rizal was on the boat, because he could speak French and German and English, no, if it was some educated guy or he meets a priest, they don't understand each other, they'd speak in Latin, no. So he was able to converse with many people. In one trip, this is one of the things that he mentions. It's quite relevant. He was on a ship, and there was a European family that brought back to Europe with them a yaya for their children, and the yaya was Visayan. And Rizal couldn't communicate with her because he only knew Tagalog. And he says, this is a countrywoman of mine, and I cannot communicate because she only knows Visayan and I only know Tagalog. So for Rizal, it was important to be global. I mean, even before it became popular, to be able to speak many languages, to be open to other cultures. No? The reason why Rizal was very upset was that the excuse for the quarantine was that they came from an infected port. But the governor of Hong Kong and Japan said our ports are disease free, so there's no reason to quarantine them. And I know they traveled all the way from Yokohama to San Francisco. There was no illness aboard. So Rizal says there was no need for the quarantine, and he was wondering how come the American customs officials will come in. Some people would American customs officials would actually eat on board the boat. So he says there's something else here. So Rizal says it's part of the Chinese exclusion policy. They just wanted to be strict about the Japanese and Chinese who were in the second and third class. He also says that although the people were not allowed to get off, the cargo was allowed to go to unload. And he says, because that was worth money, so it's more important to have the goods unloaded rather than the people. So he said that, I mean, he was very angry, but I think that was part of it. Whether this was really a racial thing, he thinks that they just didn't want the Chinese and the Japanese to land. So this was the excuse. So that's basically how we know. Because he was a European, no. So he saw. I mean, even like today, the French look down on the Americans. I mean, basically, Europeans would look down and see Americans as sort of like arrivist. So I guess that was the mindset of Rizal too. He didn't give America a chance, or he didn't stay long enough for him to actually. Uh, get rid of his initial, but again it's that, no, your first impressions always last. I mean, if he had had a nice time and he wasn't harassed during quarantine, maybe it would have colored, the and he probably would have stayed longer. It would have colored the way in which he saw the US, no. That's why we established the Centro Rizal program, so that in certain places you can have a library. Because I mean, Philippine books are hard to get in the United States. I mean, my books, while we have ebooks available in Amazon, I mean, you can't go into a Borders or Barnes and Noble and find Philippine books. So the Centro Rizals in selected diplomatic posts have a reference library, and depending on the post, they can be as active as they want. Like the Centro Rizal in Berlin, for example, one of the things that we have now is that the great diaspora. We have many Filipinos who are growing up abroad and growing up foreign. And Rizal actually writes that, there is Rizal says that when he visits one Luna in Paris, he would hold Luna's son, and then he would say, you know, he's a little Frenchman. He's not a Filipino anymore. And then another time, he had a friend in Barcelona who had his child, his son baptized, and Rizal said, yes, it's nice that your son will grow up in a free country, but we have lost, he is one more European and one Filipino less, no? So we have many children of mixed marriages who are growing up abroad. They'll never learn Filipino. So like in Berlin, they would get the children every weekend, and they would teach them, you know, basic Filipino, to remind them of part of their roots. And I think for Rizal, that is what is important, always going back to your roots. And for many Filipinos, or at least the ones who actually migrated or are traveling through the United States, it is actually when you are abroad that you learn to love your country more. But it is different if you are a Filipino who is born in the of Filipino ancestry and you're born abroad. No, so that's why we have Centro Rizal programs, so that we can keep the Filipino-ness abroad, or have a link with the Philippines in that way. Yeah, there's no mention of it. So he only mentions Chinese and Japanese people. I guess in that time, it was rare for Filipinos to travel. I mean, the great migration or for work was already in the early 20th century, when people went to Honolulu to work in sugar and pineapple plantations. But in the 19th century, I guess Rizal must have been a bit of an oddity in America, because you'll see this obviously not European man, but then he's speaking in European languages. No, like when he traveled to what is now the Czech Republic, a small town called Litomerich. I didn't put it in my presentation because it's kind of long. He actually signed the town guest book, and when I visited this a few years ago, the mayor brought out the guest book of the town, and you will see Jose Rizal signed his name on the town guest book. And they they showed us newspaper articles that this was the first time these people in this little Austrian town, now a Czech town, ever saw Filipino. They were the first Filipinos they ever saw. So it's quite interesting that in that age he was already traveling, and traveling quite a lot. No. Well, Sun Yat-sen was in Hong Kong, Rizal was in Hong Kong. They went around the same circles. Um, they knew they had the same friends, but unfortunately they did not meet. It's one of these what ifs, no, that what would have happened if they had met. Although Jose Rizal's friend Mariano Ponce, who was also part of La Solidaridad in the 1900s, 1899, he lived in Yokohama, and Sun Yat-sen would usually visit his house. I actually have photographs. When I went to the archives in Yokohama, they showed me, this is Sun Yat-sen and his Japanese friends. And I said, no, those are Filipinos who are wearing Japanese clothes. No? And then Sun Yat-sen is wearing a Western clothes, which is quite funny. But again, that's a part of our history that most people do not know, that we bought arms from Japan, and because we were at war with America, the US told the Japanese, do not export arms to a friendly country. So because we could not export our arms to Aguinaldo's men, Ponce loaned the arms to Sun Yat-sen, and they used it to gain China's freedom. So again, our part in the Chinese Revolution is that we supplied the arms. So again, it's that, no, we find many things if we are willing to look. Actually, Rizal actually is the one who gives us the name of Panday Pira. And he says there was this person in Manila who would make cannons, no. But he says, we did not. What happened to our civilization? So that's the whole point of Rizal, that he sees the Spanish colonization as it's like the Garden of Eden. It was our fall, or being thrown out of the Garden of Eden. So for Rizal, before colonization, the Philippines was perfect. It was like paradise, and it got destroyed when colonization and the Spanish came. No? So that's the mindset. But Rizal tried to think about it. So that's why he wrote in they studied the Baybayin, no, the pre-Spanish alphabet. He didn't write a book about it. He references it in his letters, but his friends like Pardo de Tavera wrote a monograph tracing Sanskrit in Tagalog. Juan Luna sometimes signed with the Baybayin characters Bu and La, which when you think about it means bulan, which is the Ilocano word for moon, which in Spanish is luna. No, so again, it's that. No, they would play around with this. Okay, and did Rizal have an opinion on American democracy? Well, he had ideas on race. He felt that America was a land where people who want to work can find work, but it had its defects. And I mean, all countries have their pluses and minuses. So Rizal saw both, so both. But unfortunately he did not. It's very strange because Rizal's travel diaries are usually very, very detailed. No, he mentions what he eats, he mentions what he sees, even the expenses he would draw. But the America trip, there's not almost nothing. And I think maybe, and he would have had time on the train. But when you read the diary, it's always, I woke up in Omaha, I woke up in Chicago. Maybe he was just sleeping on the train or doing, we don't know what he was doing on the train. No, what else? It's one of the things that we think about when we think about Filipinos who are traveling. We always envy them because we think they are just enjoying. We think of travel as enjoy. But I mean, when I would travel when I was in government, they usually take it against government people who are traveling. And I say, you don't know what it's like to travel for government. It's actually work. No? And for Rizal, we often think that Rizal was rich. I mean, he traveled first class, no, but his allowance wasn't regular. So if you read his letters, he's always sometimes, when is my allowance coming? I'm only eating potatoes, no. And his sister, before he left, his sister gave him a diamond ring and told him, when you need the money, you go to the pawn shop and pawn it. And whenever he needed money, you would see him in his diaries looking at the ring. Will I pawn this? Maybe my money will arrive tomorrow. But their money came from their sugar and rice land. Um, and you will see it was very difficult to send the money because there was no online banking, no, so, and there was no pera padala. So what they would do would be, somebody leaving Manila on a ship going to Europe, they would make padala. So they would send cash through the waiter in the boat, and sometimes the waiter will just run away with the money. But you see that even in the boat, they didn't only send him cash, they would send him noodles, they sent him bihon, they sent him halayang mangga, they sent him bagoong, they sent him embroidered piña hankies. No, so it was really literally padala. But his money, and this is very interesting because Rizal once wrote, Rizal used to be the image model for HSBC, because in one letter he wrote to his brother Pasiano and said, when you send money, you send it through the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation because their exchange rates are better. So HSBC used that, no, that, see, Rizal banked with us. But what they did not know was that if you read Pasiano's reply, he says, no, the rates are not good. I go to Standard Chartered. No, so again, Standard Chartered should actually use that. But it shows you also, one of the things that's amazing is that the Rizal family was not an ordinary family. Remember, they're based in Calamba, in Laguna. And when Rizal is writing to his brother, they're talking about what about sending our nephews here to study? They should learn things, enroll in universities abroad. And this is Pasiano Rizal, 1880s, writing to Rizal and telling him, what is the international New York price for sugar? And will the price of sugar in New York affect my harvest in Los Baños? I mean, a farmer today will not look at the international price of sugar, but this is 1880s. Your brother is talking in that way. So they were really an unusual, very well read, very cosmopolitan family. Even if it was only Rizal who had studied abroad, they really sent the money for him to go. And Rizal was always guilty that he was living off his family's wealth. But again, that's why he had to study to bring things back home. Sorry, that's a long answer. Well, they're confusing two things. No, the Battle of Manila Bay was actually a mismatch. No, although they claimed it was the greatest naval victory at the time because they sunk the entire Spanish fleet. But the Spanish fleet, if you read the accounts, were described as floating antiques. They were made of wood. The U.S. ships were metal and they were armored. They run by steam. I mean, it was really very bad. No, Manila was not well protected, so they sunk the entire fleet. The thing that was staged was that you must remember that while George Dewey sunk the Spanish fleet, he did not have the land troops to occupy and take Manila. So he had to wait. He won May 1. Then they sent soldiers from San Francisco. The soldiers only arrived in August or late July. So it was only very late, so many months later, that they had the land forces to occupy. Now, the thing here was that Intramuros had closed itself off. The Spanish were holed up and the Aguinaldo's forces just surrounded Intramuros. They cut off water and food supply. So it was only a matter of time when Intramuros would surrender. But what they did was the Spanish talked to the Americans and said, we will surrender to you. We will not surrender to these Pinoys because we think when we open the gates of Intramuros, they will massacre all the Spanish and they will loot our homes. So what the Americans and the Spanish did was they agreed that George Dewey would go. And actually, the Battle of Manila Bay is not really in Manila Bay as in Rojas Boulevard. It's actually way off in Cavite. But on August 13, 1898, the fall of Manila, George Dewey's fleet went to where the cultural center of the Philippines is now, and then they bombarded Fort San Antonio Abad so that the Spanish will appear like, we resisted and then we surrendered. So they did not want to just surrender. So Dewey bombarded the fort and then Manila surrendered. So that was the sham battle. But the first one was a real one, even if it was mismatched. Sal was already dead when the Americans came in. Uh, Again, it's depend because Rizal wrote so much, so you can just get any quote and use it. So like in his essay, futuristic essay, The Philippines Within a Century, he says that America will be interested in the Philippines. I mean, it was not really a prediction. It was his understanding of the way in which the powers were. I mean, Europe was on the wane, America was coming up. So he saw that and he mentioned it. He also mentioned in some other uh, writing that we should think about Japan because one day we will have much to do with Japan. I mean, so during the Japanese occupation, that's what they used. See, Rizal said we will have relations together. So Rizal can be used in many ways, especially for diplomacy because he traveled a lot. But Rizal was also, I mean, the whole idea of of America, it has always been a question because when he was living in the Pitan, he opened a little school. And the boys in the Pitan were not taught Spanish nor French, they were taught English. So when the Americans came in 1898-99, they found these English-speaking little boys in far off Zamboanga del Norte because they were Rizal students. So I don't know why he taught them English, but he probably felt this was a language that was worth studying in the late 19th century. That's why I mean I have this little doll. It's Sigmund Freud, and we usually think, if Freud were alive, he would ask Rizal, tell me about your mother. But the greatest influence in Rizal's life was really his mother. No, he says next to God, mothers are the next best thing. It's one of the odd things. No, the Rizal couple were very productive. They had 11 children, no, two boys and nine girls. And it's strange that Rizal's father is almost invisible. It's always the mother he's talking about. And it was the mother who ran the store, the mother who, well, kept the household with 11 children. No, the father was, I don't know, the father was just there to make children. The guy in charge of the farm was his elder brother, Pasiano. So we know very little about the father. It's the mother really who was the big influence on Rizal's life, and actually the one that made him see, because as you know, the mother was persecuted. So it was also that, I think, that inflamed uh, his patriotism and the whole idea of maybe we should not look at Spain as our colonial power anymore, and we should take the land of our birth as ours. No, many people usually say that Rizal was just a reformist. That is not true. Um, you can see from the novels that in the Noli, Rizal killed off Elias because at the time he was reform minded, but in the Fili, he becomes more radical. So the point here is that if Rizal were not shot, maybe we would have seen him. I mean, Rizal actually writes, I'd like things to be reformed, but he says, when we have done all things and Spain does not change, when we have exhausted all the means, God will provide us a weapon. And he says, I have not closed my eyes to violence and armed revolt if it is necessary. So again, it depends. Because he wrote so much, you can use Rizal to be revolutionary, you can use Rizal to be reformist. But I'd like to think that, if Rizal got the reforms, he would not stop there. And that's why they had to shoot him, because the campaign for reforms, of course, is the first step in eventually separating and becoming independent. And that, I think, is Rizal's great promise. Okay. Well, we have nothing to. I mean, it's only a few pages, his diary in the U.S. So we cannot speculate because he didn't write. No. We wish he wrote more, but again, we don't know. There's a slight chance that somewhere, somehow, maybe the diary that we have is the diary he did not write on, but there's another notebook somewhere that has something. I mean, like the Newberry Library, when I visited it for the first time in 2000, when I was on a Fulbright research grant, I was doing something else. And the librarians came out. Oh, you're Ambeth Ocampo, you're the Rizal scholar. Do you know that we have Rizal material here? Of course I know. And then he says, do you want to see the Rizal manuscript? I said, no, because I know already what that is. I mean, and it shows you what happens when you are proud and you think you know everything. So I said, no, I don't need to see it. I know, I can tell you what these things are, the letters, the diary, etc. And on my last day, the librarians insisted and said, we insist that you look at these things. And I said, sige na nga, show it to me. And to my great horror, when I opened Rizal's medical notebook, I knew the contents because I have read the transcription. What I didn't know was that there were so many drawings inside. And and I realized that they were never published because they're anatomical drawings. I said, I thought he was an eye doctor, but they're drawings of penises in different stages. No, so I said, what is the? He seems to be in the genitourinary ward. No, and I guess we how will people look at results drawings of genitalia? No, I mean, so you cannot put it in a textbook. So that's why I realized that. The things that I thought I know, I didn't know pala. So on my last trip, the 2019 trip, I looked at Rizal's 1884 diary, which is there, his Madrid diary. Again, I know the text. I brought my text with me and I said, I'll just compare notes. And I found out that the text that everyone has been using since 1909, a transcription by Retana, is missing many parts because I think they're copying it out. Many parts are missing, so I had to copy it out. And when I copied it out, I saw that we really have to go back and to look into Rizal's writing all over again. So that's just the transcription. Sometimes the translation is wrong. The translator is lazy. He will leave out one page. No, and if you're only reading the English, then you will not know that there's a paragraph missing or a sentence missing that will change the whole way in which we understand it. So I only got that when I went to the Newberry Library, and it's not just Rizal material. There are all sorts of strange things. No, I mean, just quickly, one of the strangest things that I've seen there was the trial of a woman called Adriana Kapukian. No, the name is extremely funny, but she was somebody who claimed that she could see the end of the world. So she was investigated as a witch, and that's a document that we don't really see, so the Newberry Library is has a wealth of information that we have not yet uh, even dug up. No, so I hope many younger historians will find the time to go to visit, the Newberry and also the Library of Congress to see what else lies in there that we do not know about. Rizal, I mean, Filipinos are separated from Rizal and separated from their past because of language. I'm one of the last in my generation that had Spanish in college. That has since disappeared, and I wonder where I had 12 units of Spanish when I was in college. They removed all of that. Today, my students only have 3 units of Spanish, and I said that's useless. You'll only learn uno, dos, tres in 3 units, no? And 12 units is enough for you to read. My spoken Spanish is very bad. My French is better, but it is important that you're able to read because I realized that language opens new worlds to you. No, when I was teaching in Japan, because I cannot read, I can read katakana, I can't read kanji. Um, I realized I would walk into bookstores and I would realize that there was so many books, so much knowledge that was close to me because of language. So Rizal was a polymath because he wanted to learn, and the fact that we don't know much about him is simply because we have been separated from him because of language. One of the sad facts of the American colonial period is that they while they taught us English, which was fine, they should have maintained Spanish because, again, today it is more widely spoken than English is. No, so I mean, if you're in Manila today working as a call center, a Spanish speaker earns much more than an English speaker. So again, we're going back. We hated Spain 100 years ago, but again, in the modern world, we are learning. That we need to communicate and that we should have not the old um, nationalism that we had. We must have an open-minded nationalism, a nationalism like Rizal's that is very secure. You're proud of your country, but also you're also open to the world. No, because there is a nationalism that is xenophobic and likes to close yourself off from all outside influence. We learn from Rizal what it means to be global. to be national and yet to be global, because the borders of the world, nations, their borders are slowly disappearing. We live in a global world. And Rizal is our first real global Filipino, and we can learn a lot from his life and from his experience, what it is like to be Filipino and to be global at the same time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ocampo. Well said, as always, to be global and to be Filipino at the same time. That should be our objective. So thank you so much to all our participants for staying on. I know that we've all enjoyed this webinar. So thank you so much, Dr. Ambeth Ocampo, and to our participants for joining us. We hope to have in-person presentations in the near future, so we'll have more time for discussions. For the closing remarks, we have our Deputy Consul General Raquel R. Solano. She served as Executive Director at the Office of the United Nations and International Organizations at DFA Manila. She served as Deputy Consul General in Guam and as Consul General at the Philippine Embassy in Bahrain. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Deputy Consul General Raquel Solano.
Thank you, Consul Van. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning to those who are joining us from Manila. I hope that you enjoyed our webinar, which is titled Rizal in San Francisco, Connections in Philippines-U.S. History. Thank you for joining us in this virtual event. On behalf of the Consulate General and Sentro Rizal San Francisco, we would like to thank Dr. Ambeth Ocampo for making the connections in our shared history with the United States. Thank you for sharing with us your knowledge and insights on Dr. Jose Rizal's stay in San Francisco and the rest of his trip in the United States. We hope to have more webinars with you, Dr. Ocampo, in the near future. We would also like to thank once again the National Commission for Culture and Arts for its support to the Sentro Rizal San Francisco and our cultural diplomacy initiatives. I hope that you have learned a lot from our webinar and that we all learn from the experiences of our forebears. I hope that we will take these learnings to heart as we continue to foster greater understanding of different cultures and histories, especially our Philippine history and the shared histories of the Philippines and the United States amid the many uncertainties that we are currently facing. Maraming salamat po at mabuhay tayong lahat.